Protein bars promise a lot on their wrappers. 20 grams of protein, sometimes 25, sometimes even 30, all packaged in something that looks more like a candy bar than a supplement. But independent lab testing over the past decade has repeatedly turned up a gap between what the label claims and what the bar actually delivers. And that gap isn't always an accident. The industry has a name for one of its favorite tricks: protein spiking, sometimes called amino spiking or nitrogen spiking. Most protein testing methods work by measuring nitrogen content, then using a standard conversion factor to estimate protein. The problem is that nitrogen shows up in plenty of things that aren't protein. Free amino acids like glycine and taurine are cheap to produce, and they register on a nitrogen test almost the same way real protein does. So a manufacturer can dump in a few grams of inexpensive amino acids, watch the nitrogen numbers climb, and print a protein count on the label that the bar doesn't functionally deliver in usable form. Independent labs that have run amino acid profiling, rather than relying on the basic nitrogen test, have found bars where a meaningful share of the protein on the label was actually made up of these filler compounds rather than complete bioavailable protein. Then there's the plain old shortfall, no spiking required. Testing groups that have sent protein bars to accredited labs have found products coming in 5, 10, sometimes closer to 20% below their stated protein content. Manufacturing isn't perfectly precise, and regulators generally allow some margin of error. But when the miss is consistently in one direction, always short and never over, that starts to look less like manufacturing noise and more like a labeling strategy. There's also the sneaky math of net carbs and sugar alcohols. Bars marketed as low sugar or keto-friendly often lean on sugar alcohols and fiber to shrink the number on the front of the package, even when the actual carbohydrate load and its effect on blood sugar for some people is considerably higher than advertised. The listed protein number gets the spotlight, while the rest of the nutrition panel quietly tells a different story. What makes this hard for the average shopper to catch is that nobody's handing out a mass spectrometer at the grocery store. The label is the only information available, and the label is exactly what's being gamed. The most reliable signal tends to be looking past the marketing panel entirely and reading the actual ingredient list. How far up the list real protein sources like whey isolate, milk protein, or soy protein appear, versus how much space is taken up by amino acid blends, collagen fillers, or vague terms like protein blend that don't specify a source or ratio. None of this means every protein bar on the shelf is lying to you. Plenty of brands test cleanly and deliver close to what they promise. But the pattern across independent lab investigations is consistent enough that it's worth treating any bar's protein claim the way you'd treat any other unverified number on a package. Probably close, but not something to take entirely on faith. Architected Comprehensive Protein Supplement Guide spanning testing, regulation, and consumer psychology. Architected Comprehensive Protein Supplement Guide spanning testing, regulation, and consumer psychology. It's worth stepping back and looking at how this entire category of product came to dominate grocery store checkout lines and gym bag pockets in the first place. Because the rise of the protein bar says almost as much about consumer psychology as the mislabeling issue does about manufacturing shortcuts. Protein, as a marketing word, went through a transformation over the last 15 or so years. It used to be a niche concern for bodybuilders and serious athletes, printed in small type on supplement tubs sold in specialty stores. Then it became a mainstream obsession, driven by a mix of legitimate nutrition science about satiety and muscle maintenance, and a wave of diet culture that treated protein as the good macronutrient in contrast to carbohydrates and fat. Once that shift happened, food companies of every kind, not just supplement brands, started slapping high protein claims on products that had never been formulated with protein as the primary goal. Granola bars became protein bars. Cookies became protein cookies. The word protein turned into a premium label that could justify a higher price point almost regardless of what the product actually contained, and that created exactly the kind of market incentive where cutting corners on the actual protein content becomes tempting because the claim itself is doing more of the selling than the ingredient truly deserves. The testing methodology gap is worth explaining in a bit more detail, because it's really the technical root of the whole problem. The standard method used for decades to estimate protein in food is based on measuring total nitrogen and multiplying by a conversion factor, usually around 6.25, based on the assumption that protein contains roughly 16% nitrogen by weight. This method was developed for whole foods, where nitrogen overwhelmingly comes from actual protein structures. It works reasonably well for something like a piece of chicken or a cup of lentils, but it was never designed for a manufactured product where a company can deliberately add nitrogen-rich compounds that aren't protein at all. Free amino acids, creatine, and even some non-protein nitrogen compounds can push up the nitrogen reading without contributing the same nutritional value as intact protein. This is precisely the loophole that amino spiking exploits. A more accurate method, amino acid profiling, actually breaks down and measures the individual amino acids present and tallies them up to determine true protein content, rather than relying on a nitrogen proxy. It's more expensive and time-consuming, which is part of why it isn't the default testing method required across the industry, and why so many of the mislabeling stories that break into public awareness come from investigative journalists or advocacy groups paying out of pocket for this more rigorous test, rather than from routine regulatory checks. The price per gram of protein math is another tool that tends to reveal more than the marketing copy does, and it's something any shopper can do with a calculator in the store. When you divide the price of a bar by the actual grams of protein claimed, and then compare that number across brands, wildly cheap outliers relative to the rest of the category are a signal worth noticing. In the same way, an oddly cheap steak at the grocery store might make you check the label twice. Real protein sources have a floor cost. Whey protein isolate and milk protein concentrate are commodity ingredients with prices that move with dairy markets. And while bulk purchasing gives large manufacturers an advantage, there's still a limit to how cheap a bar with genuinely high, genuinely complete protein can be produced and sold at retail while still turning a profit. When a bar undercuts that floor significantly while claiming a protein number in line with premium competitors, the ingredient list is usually where the explanation hides, whether that's amino acid fillers, a higher proportion of cheaper plant proteins with incomplete amino acid profiles, or simply a label that doesn't hold up under lab testing. Digestive symptoms are an underappreciated clue that something in a bar's formulation doesn't match its marketing, and plenty of people have experienced this without connecting the dots. Bars that lean heavily on sugar alcohols to hit a low net carb number often cause bloating, gas, or a laxative effect when consumed in the quantities people actually eat them, which is ironic for a product marketed around health and performance. This happens because sugar alcohols like maltitol or erythritol aren't fully absorbed in the small intestine, and they ferment in the gut, which is exactly the mechanism that lets companies subtract them from the net carb count in the first place. If a bar consistently causes digestive discomfort, it's often a sign that the formulation is optimized for a marketing number rather than for how the product actually performs once eaten. And that same formulation philosophy, prioritizing the number on the label over the substance of the product, tends to show up in the protein claims too. Plant-based protein bars deserve a separate mention here because the protein completeness issue is especially relevant for that segment of the market. Many plant proteins, taken individually, are missing or low in certain essential amino acids. Rice protein, for example, is relatively low in lysine, while pea protein tends to be a bit lower in methionine. Well-formulated plant-based bars address this by blending multiple protein sources, so the amino acid profiles complement each other and add up to something closer to a complete protein. Poorly formulated ones simply use whichever plant protein is cheapest and print the same protein number without acknowledging that its practical usability in the body is different from an equivalent number of grams of whey or a well-designed blend. This isn't necessarily deceptive in the same way amino spiking is, since it's usually disclosed in the ingredient list, if you know to look for it. But it does mean that two bars with identical protein numbers on the front label can offer meaningfully different nutritional value depending on the source and combination of proteins actually used. On the industry response side, it's worth noting that pressure from lawsuits, media investigations, and more nutrition-literate consumers has pushed some manufacturers toward more transparency, including third-party testing certifications and clearer labeling of amino acid content versus total protein. Some brands have made public commitments to move away from blended amino acid fillers after facing backlash, and a handful of newer companies have built their entire marketing identity around being the transparent, lab-verified alternative to legacy brands with a spiking history. Whether that transparency holds up over time as those companies scale and face the same cost pressures that pushed larger brands toward shortcuts in the first place is something only continued independent testing will reveal. The pattern in the food industry more broadly is that transparency tends to be strongest right after a scandal and tends to erode as memory of that scandal fades and competitive cost pressure reasserts itself, which is exactly why relying on a brand's current reputation rather than checking the ingredient list and available lab data for yourself is a shaky long-term strategy for anyone who genuinely cares about getting what they're paying for out of a protein bar. Hunterette, potted more. The retail environment itself plays a role in sustaining this problem, and it's worth understanding why shelf placement and packaging design matter as much as the actual chemistry. Protein bars are overwhelmingly bought as impulse or convenience purchases, grabbed at a gas station counter, a gym vending machine, or a checkout line, environments specifically designed to minimize the time a shopper spends reading anything beyond the boldest text on the wrapper. Manufacturers know this, and packaging design reflects it. The protein number is almost always the largest figure on the front of the package, often rendered in a bold circle or burst graphic meant to draw the eye immediately, while the ingredient list and full nutrition panel are relegated to the back or side in much smaller type. This isn't unique to protein bars, but the category leans on it especially hard, because protein content is functionally the entire value proposition being sold. A shopper comparing two bars side by side in a gas station cooler is almost never going to flip both over and cross-reference ingredient order under fluorescent lighting with a line forming behind them. The purchasing environment itself is part of why the gap between label and reality can persist so easily. Athletic and fitness marketing amplifies this further by attaching protein bars to aspirational identity rather than straightforward nutrition.